Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air. I'm Carl Estabrook. Our program is presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the third week of 2014. Aware was formed a dozen years ago to oppose the wars conducted by the Bush and Obama administrations. Since the world wars of the last century, war has been the principal instrument of U.S. foreign policy. Martin Luther King said almost 50 years ago that the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today was our own government, and that is still the case. In that 50 years, the American executive branch leaders have killed, wounded, and made homeless well over 20 million human beings, mostly civilians. This past week saw the anniversaries of the American atomic bomb attacks on Japan in 1945. At the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals after the war, the victors condemned to death by hanging German and Japanese leaders who committed the supreme international crime, that is worse than terrorism, described as launching aggressive war. The representative of India at the Tokyo tribunal, Raja Binod Pal, said in his carefully argued and largely ignored dissenting opinion, at the outset of the First World War, the German Kaiser wrote, "My soul is torn, but everything must be put to fire and sword. Men, women, and children, and old men must be slaughtered, and not a tree or house be left standing. With these methods of terrorism, which are alone capable of affecting a people as degenerate as the French, the war will be over in 2 months. Whereas if I admit considerations of humanity, it will be prolonged for years. In spite of my repugnance, I have therefore been obliged to choose the former system." That was the German Kaiser before the First World War. Sounds remarkably similar to things we've heard recently. The Indian jurist in 1945 said, "In the Pacific War under our consideration, if there was anything approaching what is indicated in the above letter of the German Emperor, it is the decision coming from the Allied powers to use the atom bomb. If any indiscriminate destruction of civilian life and property is still illegitimate in warfare, then in the Pacific War, this decision to use the atom bomb is the only near approach to the directives of the German Emperor during the First World War and of the Nazi leaders during the Second World War." Close quote. It has been rightly said that if the standards of the Nuremberg trials were applied, then every post-World War II American president would have been hanged as a war criminal, beginning with Truman for the atom bombing of a prostrate Japan. As for Eisenhower, whatever you may think about the Korean War, and there's a pretty complicated story when you actually look into it, the bombings in North Korea in 1951 and 52 were outright war crimes. You can read in the Air Force history about how in the Eisenhower years they had nothing left to bomb. Everything was flat. So they just bombed dams. They exult over how wonderful it was to see the water flooding down and killing people and wiping out the crops and so on. People were hanged for that, for less than that at Nuremberg. They were hanged for opening dikes. And then again, we can proceed with what happened in Guatemala, Iran, and elsewhere during the Eisenhower years. Kennedy is not even worth discussing. The invasion of South Vietnam, Kennedy attacked South Vietnam outright. 1961 and 62, he sent the U.S. Air Force to bomb villages and authorized napalm. He also laid the basis for the huge wave of repression that spread over Latin America with the installation of neo-Nazi gangsters that were always supported directly by the United States. That went on and, of course, was picked up under the Johnson administration. In the Nixon years, for example, the bombing of Inner Cambodia in 1973 was a monstrous crime. It was just massacring peasants in Inner Cambodia. It isn't much reported here because nobody paid attention, but it was quite a part in it played quite a part in helping create the basis for the Khmer Rouge. The CIA estimate is that 600,000 people were killed in the course of those U.S. bombing attacks, either directed or actually carried out by the United States. In the Carter years, there were major crimes. For example, the Indonesian invasion of East Timor, which happened to start under Ford and led to the nearest thing to genocide since the Holocaust, maybe a third or a fourth of the population being slaughtered. That was using 90% U.S. arms. In the Carter years, when the Indonesians were actually running out of arms in their attack on this country, Carter actually increased the flow of arms in 1978, which is the worst peak of the slaughter. And Carter was backing Somoza and his National Guard in Nicaragua, openly and with direct military and diplomatic support at a time when they had killed about 40,000 people in the terror of the last days of their regime. And that is, again, just a sample. Going on to the Reagan years, it's not even a question. In fact, the U.S. was condemned by the World Court during the Reagan years for its unlawful use of force, meaning terrorism, in Nicaragua. In Central America alone, maybe 200,000 people or so were slaughtered in a very brutal fashion by U.S.-run programs. In Southern Africa, about 1.5 million people were killed, and over $60 billion of damage was done, according to the UN Commission, which reviewed it later from 1980 to 1988. That's from South African atrocities that the U.S. was directly supporting. Bush 1, the invasion of Panama, for example, was simply outright aggression. It was condemned internationally. The U.S. was able to veto the Security Council condemnation, but that doesn't change the fact that those condemnations were there. When we move on to the Clinton years, one of his first acts within a few months was to send missiles to bomb Baghdad. He only killed about 8 people, but the pretext was so ludicrous, it's embarrassing to repeat it. The pretext was that this was self-defense against armed attack, because 2 months earlier there had been a failed attempt by someone who might or might not have been Iraqi, no one knew at the time, to kill Bush 1. About half of military aid and training to Latin America under Clinton was going to Colombia, which has absolutely the worst human rights record in the hemisphere, killing thousands of people in a horrifying fashion. These are all crimes before his attack on Serbia, backed by outright lies that it was a humanitarian operation. I don't think it's hard to set up a bill of indictment through the Clinton administration. We've discussed frequently on this program the continuity of the Bush II and Obama administrations with what went before, in spite of the fact that Americans keep voting against foreign wars. The Congress, however, working for the 1% who profit from U.S. economic hegemony in the world, while the rest of us pay for it, refuses to stop presidents from a policy of continual war crimes. So you're listening to Aware on the Air. We'll consider some current aspects of the U.S. government's war policies tonight, with reports and comments from Karen Aram on the pivot to Asia, Stuart Levy on Western colonialism, David Johnson on the pivot to Ukraine, Ron Zoke on Kissed by Uncle Sam, and comments from Yakov Ziso, A History Lesson, and comments from Karen Evans-Levy. We'll begin with Ron Zoke, Kissed by Uncle Sam.
What I'm alluding to is the acronym KST, Known or Suspected Terrorist. There is such a list kept by the American government, Uncle Sam. It was leaked apparently by someone to Jeremy Scahill and others who has reported on it in Amy Goodman's show. Leaked classified documents revealed that the U.S. government's no-fly list is now 47,000 names long, and that more than 40% of the 680,000 names contained in the U.S. terrorist screening database, which is shared by law enforcement, private contractors, and foreign governments, are of people with no recognized terrorist group affiliation. So the mystery is being maintained about what exactly gets you onto this blacklist of people who are known or suspected terrorists. Apparently that's an official secret, and you will go to prison if they find out that you have revealed what it is. And other accounts have made clear that it's surprisingly little what's called giving material support to a terrorist organization, such as Hamas. So if any of us here say anything, for example, that might sound favorable to Hamas, then that can be classified as giving them material support and apparently could put us under indictment. So think about that, people. Big Uncle is watching you. I wanted to remark here on something that's not been talked about here much before, and that is the use of anti-personnel weapons, particularly by the USA and by Israel, which is kind of important, I think, in view of the moralistic pretensions of both of these warrior nations. Cluster bombs used or so-called daisy cutters, used in Vietnam and other places by the USA. Landmines, which have been recently repudiated, outlawed by over 100 countries around the world, but not by the USA. We need more time to deal with that, we're told. White phosphorus, which reports say have been used by the Israeli Defense Force in Gaza, although they've been denying it. And it's a little complicated because white phosphorus, which burns and sticks to the skin, and is a much dreaded weapon. It's used primarily, it's legal apparently according to international law, to use it for creating smoke screens and flares, because these things are often set off in the air and they cast a very bright white light and can be illuminating things, or their smoke can be used to obscure things. So white phosphorus is a very useful weapon in war. Let's see, here's some of the accounts of it. An Israeli white phosphorus round explodes over Gaza residential area. In its early statements, the Israeli military repeatedly denied using white phosphorus, saying, "We categorically deny the use of white phosphorus, and the IDF acts only in accordance with what is permitted by international law and does not use white phosphorus." It eventually admitted to its use and stopped using the shells, however, saying that a media buzz led to its decision to do so. Numerous reports from human rights groups during the war indicated that white phosphorus shells were being used by Israel in populated areas. That is the part that's illegal under international laws, using them in populated areas. And that's has been done by the IDF. Let's mention also, flechette shells. These are shells fired from artillery or from tanks. Shrapnel, hundreds of little metal darts from 2 to 6 inches long. There are pictures of them embedded in the walls of Gaza. You can see them. And I'm not sure about the legal status of this internationally, but it seems to make no difference anyway. Report: the Israeli military is using flechette shells, which spray out thousands of tiny and potentially lethal metal darts in its military operation in Gaza. Flechette shells were fired toward the village of Quza, east of Khan Yunis, in July, according to the Palestinian Center for Human Rights. Nahala Kalab Najjar, 37, suffered injuries to her chest, it said. PCHR provided a picture of flechettes taken by a field worker last week. The IDF did not deny using the shells in conflict. So there's another instance of accusation and denial, and we'll see whether the denial turns out to be true or false. These things sometimes take years to emerge. This is somewhat reminiscent of the Jonathan Pollard case, which got him jailed for spying for Israel for a number of years. The Israeli government very fervently and explicitly denied that Pollard was an Israeli spy, and then maybe after 10 years or so, they finally admitted it. Well, yes, he was, but you should release him anyway. So there's another instance. The Amnesty International report on American atrocities in Afghanistan has come to light this week. I don't have a full report on it, but I'll just mention a couple of other things that I think might be worth discussing today. Washington Times, Carter's Hamas support based on grudge. So this is their explanation. They accuse former President Jimmy Carter of supporting Hamas, which is false. But this right-wing site, Newsmax, says former President Jimmy Carter has held a grudge against the Jewish people since their vote helped Ronald Reagan defeat him for a second term in office in 1980, according to an editorial in the Washington Times. And that grudge is showing itself in his support of Hamas terrorists in the Gaza conflict. That is utter garbage. But anyway, someone else's theory about the true secret motive of other people. Oh, here's another one. Lindsey Graham, the senator, accuses Obama of trying to avoid bad news stories with his airdrops in Iraq. President Barack Obama's airdrops of supplies to refugees and limited airstrikes against ISIS in Iraq are only an attempt to avoid bad press and don't go far enough in stamping out the dangerous terrorist group, says Senator Lindsey Graham. So another one from the Newsmax website. This has become just absolutely overwhelming, bewildering. U.S. generals on Iraq. Obama must do more than pinprick airstrikes. 3 generals agree that if President Barack Obama is serious about addressing the threat posed by Iraq by the militant group Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, he must do more than mere pinpricks of targeted airstrikes. So Lieutenant General Tom McInerney told Fox and Friends that limited airstrikes that the United States began on Friday against ISIS forces were less than pinpricks, and it would take a broader air campaign strategy to hinder the advancement of ISIS militants. And this thought that the American bombing was too little and too late was apparently echoed by General Jack Keane and General Bob Scales. So it goes. Obama's being attacked by a lot of our more conservative citizens for not going in fast enough, hard enough. Indeed, for ever talking about getting out at all and setting a deadline for it. So it's another case of damned if you do and damned if you don't. And maybe my colleagues here will comment on that.
Yes, I
Thank
would
you,
love
Ron.
to.
Yep.
Sorry.
Karen, go ahead.
Yes, I would love to. I've got something by Alan Mast of the left. I'm going to come from the left now on this particular topic, and that is the fact that along with what we're seeing on the corporate-owned media, specifically CNN, we're going in to rescue the group on the Mount Sinjar, the Kurds and people, the Yazidis, I think they're called, who are the latest victims of a savage civil war set in motion during the U.S. occupation with the connivance of American military and political authorities. This very much reminds me of the Hmong and the way we treated them after the Vietnam War. We pretty much left them behind. And though we did bring some over, we got some on planes and brought them over, the majority were left in refugee camps. So this is similar to what's happening to these people. But we're using, on the mainstream media, we're using this whole thing about saving the children. We have to go in and we have to drop milk and diapers and food to these poor people. And it shows them dropping these food supplies, and then they actually rescue, I would guess maybe 20 people. It just appeared to me to be so staged and so reminiscent of what we had in 1975 with the so-called orphan rescue. But I want to point out something else on this. The hypocrisy, the absolute hypocrisy of 1 minute we're so concerned with these people, especially children, women and children, while at the same time we're supporting our ally Israel and the killing of all these children and women and civilians in Gaza. It boggles the mind how we get away with that. But I also want to point out one more thing that I haven't picked up anywhere except Amy Goodman made the statement briefly yesterday. She said that it's important to recognize that northern Iraq, where the Kurdish area, which we know the U.S. has sort of been occupying, and they've set up schools and done good things for the Kurds, is very rich in oil. In fact, Chevron and Exxon are there now. So when they talk about how they have to rescue some of our people, and they actually did say this morning that American interest is how they refer to it. So I want to point out that the American interest is rarely people. We're more apt to kill people and concern ourselves with their resources.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of talk about humanitarian intervention. So we're conducting a humanitarian intervention in Iraq, but apparently none in Gaza. Where
Right.
many more people
Right.
have been
But
killed,
we
1,900 of them.
Right, but we have the UN. We have the UN to do these humanitarian rescues. Why are we insisting that we have to go in and do it? So I think Phyllis Bennis, I'm not sure if I have her name correctly, made that comment.
And at
Yeah.
the same time, we're announcing that we will not allow Russia to use that as an excuse for intervening in eastern Ukraine. So you can't do that. That's absolutely not allowed to use this humanitarian gimmick.
Excuse.
Yeah.
Excuse.
Karen, do you want to go on and talk about the pivot to Asia, or should we
go
continue with
to-
Ukraine?
David with the Ukraine.
Okay. David
Okay,
Johnson?
first a comment. I mean, frankly, when has the people who control our government, the United States government, ever really been concerned about humanitarian crisis, unless there's a reason for it? Where was this concern back when the massacres were going on in Uganda and Burundi or Zaire? At that point, there was no strategic interest there for the 1%. Well, you see how this, what was it a few years ago in Somalia? There was all this concern about what was going on there in the southern part of the country. Turns out another oil-rich country. And we see this over and over again. This seems to be the latest deception, if you will, or smokescreen to try to intervene militarily with the excuse that it's for humanitarian reasons, and oh yes, we're helping the children. So yes, another one of these similar tactics. But I want to talk about what's going on in Ukraine, because there's just been so little coverage of what's really been going on there in the American corporate media, and what coverage there has just been so distorted that it's just unbelievable. Right now, there's a humanitarian crisis, a real humanitarian crisis going on in the eastern Ukraine, and it's being caused by a government in Kiev that's basically financed by our tax dollars, that was brought into power by our tax dollars and other little subversions behind the scene that basically got rid of a previously democratically elected government and brought in a new government that was going to be more compliant to agree to sign IMF and World Bank and EU agreements that was going to basically greatly impoverish the average Ukrainian people. And this previous elected government originally was considering doing it, and then they backed out the last moment because they didn't want to face the consequence. Basically they didn't want to see this happen to the people of Ukraine. So this new government was brought in by the usual techniques of NGOs, non-government organizations that are supposedly democracy movements, which are phony, just like what they've tried to do in Venezuela in years past. This ultimately led to a violent coup against this democratic elected government, and then this government was immediately recognized by the Obama administration. This new government immediately appointed some outright neo-fascists into the government, 8 ministers in the cabinet, and appointed 20 of these right-wing fascist members of this political party, the Svoboda Party, into governorships, which these 5 governorships that they appointed covers about 20% of the population of the Ukraine. Amongst all this that was going on, the eastern Ukraine, a couple of provinces there, wanted to succeed and form their own autonomous regions. And ever since the government of Kiev, with the help of our tax dollars, including even Blackwater mercenaries, of course now they have a new name, Greystone, have been basically bombarding not just rebels that have taken up arms to basically defend their autonomous regions, but also have targeted city centers, killing scores of civilians, including women and children. There's been hundreds of thousands of refugees pouring over the border into Russia to safety, and this is just continuing on. And what's amazing about this is not just the silence of the American corporate media about this real humanitarian crisis that's being caused by our tax dollars, but to basically try to divert attention from these facts and try to blame everything on Putin and Russia. You know, I haven't seen anything like this in years. I mean, really, if you think about it, what is in the best interest of the American people to potentially have a war with Russia? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And you have to wonder what this is all about, really. I mean, is it just strategic alignment, you know, positioning? They want to get close to Russia to try to contain it in case of a future economic war, if you will, or an actual war. Or is it over the whole thing about natural gas? Because there's Western Europe has been buying natural gas from Russia for, well, decades now, and maybe this is part of it too, to cut off natural gas supplies to the Europeans, and then basically the American companies will come in and sell it to them at, of course, a very high marked up rate. And this wouldn't be the first time that the one American corporate special interest has controlled our foreign policy in this country, and especially coming from the oil energy interests in this country. This stuff, it's like sort of the same old story, same players, or I should say same old story with different actors, a little bit different script, but the theme is the same. And the majority of the American people do not support this. We have much needed things we need to be done here at home. The money could be much better spent here in the United States. And this is just, again, another example of people losing control of their elected officials. And this has to stop. And I mean, it's not going to stop until we start holding these people we elect accountable and calling them on this, because they don't seem like they care about what we think anymore.
Thank you, David. This Russian situation, the situation in Ukraine, is remarkably serious, and it's serious as indicated about how little it's being talked about by the American government and the media. You have to remember the recent history here. During the Clinton years, the U.S. attempted to reduce Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union essentially to the status of a third world country. In the Yeltsin years, we tried to make sure that Russia would not be an economic competitor in any way to the United States, but would be at best a provider of resources, particularly energy resources, all under control of American economic hegemony in Europe and Asia. The source of the present war hysteria on the part of the American government was the unwillingness of Russia under Putin to play that role and to establish, most notably, an effective economic alliance with the Chinese to counter this drive to American economic hegemony. Ron has made fun of the American position here as an attempt to isolate Russia and China. Well, that's about right. That's about what the American government is trying to do, and it's trying to do it with the threat of war. It's very serious, and it's not being talked about at all.
Yeah, excuse me, I would like to comment also that now that Russia has retaliated with its own sanctions many of the people in the Baltic states, and I've communicated with people in Finland, I mean, they're very distraught because they import a lot of food and from the U.S. and other places. But they're not blaming Russia because they accept that he had to retaliate in some way. But come winter, they're going to be cold because they'll be cut off from their gas. And food is something that's very important to those areas where they're not agricultural communities. So they're angry at the EU and they're angry at the U.S. and rightfully so. One other comment I would like to make is that China and Russia have just set up a school, sort of a consortium between the two of them in Shenzhen, which is right over the border of Hong Kong in China. And they will be training primarily students on technology for the future. So that's one of their first, or it's not their first, but it's another major collaboration between the two of them.
Just to clarify here about the part of the Kiev Ukraine government that our tax dollars are supporting, the Svoboda and the right sector parties, the neo-fascist parties in the Kiev government. Independent Western scholars have documented the fascist origins, contemporary ideology, and declarative symbols of both Svoboda and the right sector parties. Both movements glorify Ukraine's murderous Nazi collaboration in World War II as inspirational ancestors. Both, to quote Svoboda's leader, Ola Tyanibok, call for an ethnically pure nation purged of the, and this is a quote, Moscow Jewish mafia and other scum, including homosexuals, feminists, and political leftists. These are the people our tax dollars are supporting.
Kiev.
I think it was John Pilger or Seamus Milne or one of the British commentators who pointed out that the government that the U.S. promoted in Ukraine is the first government since the Second World War to have explicitly fascist parties in it.
Yeah.
That's the result of our diplomacy. You're watching Aware on the Air. We have a few minutes, I think, to turn to pivot to Asia,
Okay.
Karen, if you like.
Yeah, a little known, little concerned interest is right now would be Burma, but I won't go into too much detail, but Human Rights Watch on Thursday issued a statement regarding the Burmese government, how they have not taken a public stand against the Buddhist leaders who have been fomenting anti-Muslim sentiment, preventing further sectarian violence, and abandoning discriminatory legislation. They're calling for a reform of the 2008 Constitution, which precludes Aung San Suu Kyi from running. I won't go into a lot of the detail, but bottom line, what the Human Rights Organization has said is that this aggressive expansion into the Shan area, where they said they have 3,000 troops have been deployed to this area as of June against the Shan State Army, and that they're terrorizing, displacing hundreds of civilians. And this endangers and displaces civilians. It throws further doubt on claims by the Burmese government that it is seeking peaceful settlement to the ethnic conflict. And they're calling on the U.S., specifically Senator Kerry, or Senate Head of State Senator Kerry, the national military-to-military engagement offered by the U.S. to Burma's reformist government. The U.S. has embraced Thein Sein's leadership, suspending most economic sanctions against Burma, and Obama is expected to visit Burma in November. And so they're asking Kerry, who was just there this weekend, they were asking him when he visits to deliver a clear and public message of deep concern about serious human rights problems, including continued persecution of the Rohingya. These are the Muslims in the Arakan state, and continued military abuses against ethnic groups and the need for constitutional reform. Now, they issued this on Thursday. Kerry, in spite of his, I mean, with all the pressing needs we have in Iraq, in Gaza, and in the Ukraine, and he was in Burma on Saturday and Sunday to attend this, what they call, it's a meeting of ASEAN. This is their Burma's chairmanship of the ASEAN nations. And he did then meet with Aung San Suu Kyi briefly. And when he was asked if he discussed, what did he discuss then with the military junta in relation to Human Rights Watch request, he said, oh, we talked about human rights, about the law, democracy, and how to move it on forward, blah, 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 blah. And I won't go into any more detail. But my reason for bringing this up is that I still maintain, especially with the fact that Burma has canceled their railroad project with China, which based the claim of the head of the railroad and some of the spokespersons who do not wish to be named was that, well, foreign influences, that's us, have commented that it's due to human rights abuses that they're canceling the train project with China, which I found quite amusing. Thailand just canceled their train project also, as they went on to purchase more military weapons.
Karen,
So
why are you calling them Burma and not in Myanmar?
I call it Burma, and Kerry, they even mentioned that he vacillated between Myanmar and Burma. Most of the human rights activists who were active, we just call it Burma. There's nothing wrong with the name Myanmar, but it was given by an illegitimate military junta.
Thanks.
So I'm sorry, I just can't bring myself to say Myanmar, even though it means the same thing.
And the allegation is that human rights abuses committed by the Chinese railroad builders?
No,
I
they don't.
misunderstood that.
No, they're saying that something to do with human rights abuses.
Yeah.
They're not
But what are they saying?
penalizing
Yeah.
China. They're not saying about China. It's probably on the part of their own government. It's just, it's nonsense. It doesn't make any sense at all. Because, I mean, let me give you, all right, I'm going to give you just one more statement here. I don't want to take up too much time on this. But Burma can renegotiate dam deals to keep more power, says a Chinese firm. Basically, Burma had a signed contract, okay, with China to offer them gas. All right, now we know China has now got contracts with Russia.
Right.
For a lot of gas, so they're not as desperately in need. But it's important to note that despite having abundant natural gas and hydropower potential, only around a quarter of Burma's 60 million people have access to electricity. They're among the lowest rates in Asia, okay? And this is according to October 2012 Asian Development Bank report. Burma's semi-civilian government has promised to supply electricity to the entire country by 2030. So now, Burma is now telling China that, well, gee, we don't think we can keep up our contract because we need to supply more energy to our own people. And China has said, fine, your people come first. That's okay.
The suggestion that there may be other players in this, the Pentagon uses a phrase called offshore control, which refers to the attempt to try to deny energy resources to China. That is shipped into China, liquid gas, oil, and so forth, being shipped into China as one of our weapons against China, one of our ways of controlling the East Asian economy. That's standard locution, apparently, in the Pentagon. And the Russian-Chinese deal 2 months ago, or whenever it was a terrible slap in the face to the Pentagon notion that we can control the movement of energy in East Asia. So it's hard not to see this as part of that.
And the
connected.
cancellation of the railroad project
Exactly.
with China, because that would give China control of the railroad.
Thank you, Karen. You're watching Aware on the Air. We'll turn to Stuart Levy with some comments about Western colonialism in this history hour that we're in the midst of.
So let me see. Maybe I'll start with this. A little over a century ago, there was a British Prime Minister, Henry Campbell Bannerman, who it turns out was also Secretary of State for War, and he was the head of the Liberal Party at the time. But one of the things he did, well, I'll read from this. He formed a committee from some famous scholars from Great Britain, France, Belgium, Holland, Portugal, Spain, and Italy. Specialists in history and geography and economics, oil, agriculture, and colonialism, to study possible ways to assure the continuity of European colonial interests. So he was foreseeing, well, let's see. He said to them, empires grow in power to a certain extent and expand, and then gradually disintegrate and collapse. So we understood this. He asked them to find a way to delay the fate of European colonialism, which had reached its peak. This was happening at the time when the sun did not set on the British Empire, but he knew that one day it would and wanted to delay the day. After studying the establishment and fall of old empires and the existing conditions early in the 20th century, they drew up their suggestions in a report, which ended in a declaration that the dangers facing colonialist empires lay in the Arab lands if and when they were liberated, united, and were to progress. So they recommended to the 7 colonial powers to maintain the prevailing status quo in the region, with the Arabs divided and backward, and to keep its people in their current status, ignorant and quarreling. The report also recommended fighting the unity of the people of the Arab nation culturally, spiritually, and historically, resorting to strong scientific means. I'd like to know what that meant, but anyway. But keeping the Western Arabs separate from the Eastern Arabs, that is, separate the African wing from the Asian wing of Muslims, I imagine, by establishing a foreign and powerful barrier on the land bridge that connects the Arab Sea with Arab Africa. So here's a quote from this, from the report now. They write, there are people, the Arabs, the editor notes, there are people who control spacious territories teeming with manifest and hidden resources. They dominate the intersections of world routes. Their lands were the cradles of human civilizations and religions. These people have one faith, one language, one history, and the same aspirations. No natural barriers can isolate these people from one another. If perchance this nation were to be unified into one state, it would then take the fate of the world into its hands and would separate Europe from the rest of the world. Taking these considerations seriously, here's the recommendation, a foreign body should be planted in the heart of this nation to prevent the convergence of its wings in such a way that it could exhaust its powers in never-ending wars. It could also serve as a springboard for the West to gain its coveted objects. So this was from this report in 1907. The report was suppressed, at least it wasn't publicly distributed. There were apparently a couple of mentions of it in the late 40s and late 50s. But more recently, and I'm not sure whether this is this year or in the last decade, around the centennial, it has become available. So the commentary written by a modern Arab person from where I don't know, at the time the Arab homeland, he says, was divided into European colonies and Ottoman territories, while the Zionist movement had already achieved considerable success in immigration to Palestine and in colonizing parts of it, especially with the unlimited British support extended to the Zionist movement in this and other fields, and the collusion of the ruling Turkish group of unity and advancement in the Ottoman Empire at the time. That's a nice phrase. It seems to be a pretty common phrase. I mean, think of the Brazilian, order in progress. I mean, people must have been really thinking in those terms in those days.
I think it has fascist roots, doesn't it? Go ahead.
that right? Well,
or maybe the
maybe
fascists simply adopted it.
I think you're
Yes,
right. They just liked it too.
Right.
So, along with supporting Jewish emigration and colonization in Palestine, the UK and France concluded the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916, not long after this report, dividing the Fertile Crescent into Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq as the British share, and Syria and Lebanon as the French ones. They comment, this has surprised me, the French really wanted to have Palestine, but the British insisted on it, of course, in order to establish a Jewish homeland there, says the translator. And not long after followed the Balfour Declaration, which was approved by President Wilson and the French and Italian governments in the Vatican. There was no consideration of the Palestinian Arabs as a people that have political rights. They were considered merely to be religious sects having only civil and religious rights. The British government from 1917 to 47 did not allow the establishment of a constitutional system in Palestine, while it granted the Zionists autonomy and a role in the decision-making along with the British mandate authorities on all levels. While it stirred controversies among the Arab cities' dignitaries and rural Arab clannishness, and made use of its relations with the Arab regimes to abort the Palestinian Arab patriotic movement, as during the 1936 Palestinian Arab strike, the big uprising that was violently put down. Maybe I'll stop with that, but the point, of course, is to say, that what we see happening now in Israel-Palestine, it served the British as it serves us. So I'll see if anybody would like to comment on that.
What was the name of that report again, Stuart, in 1907?
The Bannerman,
Bannerman, okay.
Bannerman report.
Question. I had someone send me a petition asking me to sign to repeal the Balfour Declaration. So I had to go and look it up, of course. And I know there were two, actually, the first one and the second one. I think only the first one, if I'm not mistaken, has any real teeth. But I didn't sign it because I didn't know whether that was just waste or would it be of any value? I mean, it would be going to the British, I think, right? Petition to the Brits to
Who no
repeal
longer have
the
a
Balfour
mandate.
Declaration. Yeah.
I guess I'm puzzled by that too.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I was puzzled, so
Unless
I.
it's a matter of unless it's just a matter of teaching people history.
Well,
which is
the-
what it's
No,
doing.
it was an actual petition, but it was coming from Egypt. Someone
I'd
in
like to
Egypt.
comment too about
Yeah.
about this. Number one, I think that it's very useful that we go into the history and we look into the details. And I don't necessarily agree with what the characterizations that Stuart read, but I do want to emphasize his point. I think this is an excellent point, which is that it was colonial powers who drew the map of the Middle East. It had nothing to do with the way in which people in the Middle East would collaborate, would kind of find ways to live with each other. It was pretty much against that.
Yeah.
And this is something to remember. And of course, this has to do also with the drawing of the maps of Israel, Palestine, etc. But this is very important. It was power that was applied to draw the maps of people who could have lived together perhaps very much differently. And we see the results of that up to today. I have another comment about what Ran said with the arms and ammunition. This is something that's taken from yesterday's Haaretz. So pretty much, there are three companies in Israel. There's the IAI, which stands for Israel Arms Industries. There's something called Elbit, and there's something called Rafael. Rafael are very famous now because they developed the Iron Dome.
Yeah.
They create together $6 billion yearly manufacturing arms. And this is now the way it goes. 80% of that is being exported to foreign countries. 20% are used locally, as in what the IDF is using. But the way it goes is that, let's just say that they are going to, especially for the IAI, all these companies work directly with the IDF. So the way it goes is that the more profit they have in selling outside, the cheaper they can sell them to the IDF.
Right.
That's the way that it is contracted. Now, back to these arms that are being sold, one of the things that is said in the article, and I'll be glad to share it with the aware list, is also that in times of peace, these companies, I mean, they can sustain their profits for a while, but not for long. That doesn't mean that they are really they were built in order to create war. But war is good for business.
Or it's good for
Right,
business.
right.
Yes.
Let me say it
Absolutely.
again in French. War is good for business.
Yeah.
So that's now to the history lesson that I wanted to bring. I was amazed. I was talking to a classmate of mine. We are both of the generation who went to reserves in 1982 during the invasion to Lebanon. So the invasion to Lebanon, just schematically, there was an assassination of the ambassador Argov in London by the Abu Nidal group. Following that, the Israeli army, and at the time, Ariel Sharon was the Ministry of Defense, and Menachem Begin was the Prime Minister. So at the time, the IDF, in retaliation to the assassination attempt by Abu Nidal, they invaded Lebanon, they invaded Beirut. And by the way, militarily, Beirut was the first populated city that the IDF invaded. And at the time, just before the invasion, the second in command in the IDF headquarters resigned, saying the IDF is for defense, not for invading. Anyway, especially after the IDF invaded Beirut, so then the Falangist people who were basically put there, installed there by the Begin and Sharon tactics, they basically massacred overnight over 1,000 inhabitants of the two neighborhoods, Sabra and Shatila. Now, I'm not going to go into the war of, it was called the invasion to Lebanon, then it was called the first war of Lebanon, because then there was also a second one. I'm not going to go into that in this history class. The history class that I wanted to go was more into what was the aftermath of the Sabra and Shatila and the invasion to Lebanon. A United Nations committee investigated the issues and accused Israel of unnecessary violence and of genocide. In Israel, there was a committee that was called the Kahan Committee, who found several things about the invasion, including that Ariel Sharon was directly and indirectly responsible for the massacres in Sabra and Shatila. And they called for his resignation. Menachem Begin didn't want to fire Sharon, and Sharon didn't want to resign. The bottom line of that was that Sharon was moved to another portfolio in the government. He was called a minister without portfolio. That was his portfolio. And we know that Ariel Sharon became essentially after that a prime minister. So the lesson of the whole issue is that now that we see what is the aftermath of Gaza, if Gaza ever ended, is that all these hopes, so to speak, that we have about, well, they are going to find Israel and they're going to accuse Israel, etc. This is a lesson in history. I don't think that this is going to change much. Change is going to come from elsewhere. That's the end of the second.
Where do you think it'll come from, Yaakov?
I think, as I said last week, and I said last week, 2 weeks ago, I think that the only way to look for a change, it will be to talk directly to the Palestinians, to their leaders, to the Hamas leaders, to Abbas, who is now pretty much empowered by the fact that he behaved in a much more diplomatic way than anybody else. And the people of Palestine recognize that. That will be the only way to speak directly with them and to, as soon as possible, enable the people of Gaza by themselves to construct and reconstruct their place. All these issues of giving their assistance and Hamas, that's not going to do much. That's my opinion, but I'm working on it as we speak. I mean, this opinion is basically work in project because we see what's going on. And we hope now that at least that the ceasefire is going to be maintained.
So you were in the IDF in 1982?
Yeah.
And so what did you do?
Well, I was in Urbana and I returned to Israel on the 5th of June. And the password at the airport in Tel Aviv, which was the melody, was playing. So I had to report to my unit right away.
Oh, I see.
And I had to, I mean, with the luggage from here, I had a lot of LPs that I bought in Urbana and I brought to Israel. So I went back to my unit and I had, at some point, I had to also go to a place called Alei, which is some of the suburbs overlooking Beirut. And I didn't want to go, so I basically refused order and I was put in jail and blah, blah.
So how long were you in jail?
If you call this a living. Well, I was in jail for about 14 days, and then I had I came up with some pretext that my vision is not so good. I had very thick glasses, and somehow I got out of reserves, and I never went back.
Would you consider yourself a conscientious objector? I mean,
Yes,
what was
but
the reason
that
you
word I do, but that doesn't exist. That did
I know,
not exist
I
in the
know,
dictionary
yeah,
of the
right.
Israeli army at the
Right.
time. You have an order, you obey the order.
The only major difference
Excuse me,
I
by the
would
way,
have with the...
I came back to Urbana as soon as I could.
Sounds wise. The lesson you draw from from this history, Yaakov, I would disagree with this only to this extent, that the only possibility of a solution and the prevention of another example of mowing the lawn in Gaza by Israel is an imposition of a peace of some sort by the United States. The only reason Israel is able to behave as it does is the support that it receives from the United States economically, militarily, diplomatically, politically. Absent that, Israel would not, in fact, would not have been able to invade Lebanon, would not have been able to invade Gaza this last month. The U.S. is the crucial player in this horrible drama. And the only way a resolution can be arrived at is for the U.S. to impose it.
I don't disagree with you about this academically, but in practice, I think that anything have to do with imposing, anything to do with power, any place of power in this case won't work.
Well,
I agree.
Well, I mean, there already are plays of power.
Yeah.
We just
They're already in
we're
place.
pushing on the wrong side. So one thing that Noam Chomsky suggested yesterday was an arms embargo. Other people have talked about that. From the U.S. or from the world, it's certainly not an unheard of sort of solution. And I know we've been, during the current conflict, we've been shipping arms to Israel, which seems a bit strange given that it has this vibrant arms industry of its own. So I really don't know how much of the military supplies that Israel uses come from imports compared to its own manufacture. I mean, in just that sort of limited material way, how effective could an arms embargo be at?
But it would
At
also
the-
be shipping out, exporting.
Well, their export, what did you say, Yakov? You said a
80%.
percentage, 80%, and the other 20% goes to IDF?
The Iron Dome, for example, yes, and the Iron Dome, for example, has been, it's a very popular item bought by South Korea and other countries, Canada. I don't remember the list. I'm not too much into weapons, even though I should be. I mean, it's a good income.
But that makes sense then. If they're only using 20%, okay, of their local manufactured weapons, then they import 80% from the U.S.
No,
That's
export.
not that's not what he's
The
making.
export,
They
the
make
export
and export
industry
them.
has a 4/5 surplus.
We're going to have to abandon this important topic.
Okay.
You've been watching Aware on the Air, and inshallah, we'll be back next week to try it again.
Inshallah.
The Aware on the Air is presented by members and friends of the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. And our thanks to Jason Liggett, Yosef Cash for direction and production. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. We've had requests this week for information about Aware's anti-war demonstrations, which typically take place on the first Saturday of every month. We'll talk about that some more next week. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Ron Zoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Johnson, Yaakov Ziso, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.